welcome to the Dave Cast for Saturday, May 23rd. If you've been tracking along with us, I started teaching a series this week on the book of Exodus. And so now we are on part 3, and we are also in chapter 3. And that's all been working out nicely to this point because we've been taking about a chapter per episode. But alas, that is all going to end today, because there is simply no way that we are going to be able to cover all or even most of chapter 3 today. And actually, to tell you, my goal is for us to cover the first 5.5 verses. We're going to stop about midway through verse 6. And because I tell you, lots of times we just barrel through these sections whenever we encounter them, because it's a 20-minute sermon or it's a 10-week Bible study, and it's got certain limits on it, and you got to keep a certain pace. But I just love the Old Testament. And particularly, I love these sections where there is just layer upon layer of really significant and symbolic stuff that's going on. And so since we are really under no deadline here, we have no idea how long this series is going to take. We're just going to take it at our own sweet time. Is that okay? I hope so. That's what I'm going to do. And so let's just jump right in for today. And I'm going to give you a quick sort of 2-sentence review to catch us up on where we are so far in the story of Moses and the Exodus. Moses, having been chased out of Egypt and away from his Hebrew people, is now out shepherding sheep for his Midianite father-in-law named Jethro, which he's been doing now for about 40 years. And so that might have been 3 sentences, I don't know. But here, out in the wilderness, Moses comes upon the mountain of God, known as Mount Horeb, at least in this verse, which it will come to be known as Mount Sinai in a few chapters. Last episode, I think we spent a little bit of time talking about how it can be a little bit confusing in Exodus, because people and places can be called by different names at different times. And so you really have to catch up and see what's going on. But what's important to know here is that in the ancient world, mountaintops were the traditional dwelling places for the divine. That's where God was. And so Moses is out shepherding. He happens upon this mountain. He's looking up at it, I guess. And then he's watching his sheep, and then suddenly he sees something burning. And it gets his attention. It's a bush. It's a burning bush. But what really gets his attention about this is that even though this bush is burning, which he's, I'm sure, seen before, it's not being consumed. The bush is staying whole like a bush, and it's burning, but there are no ashes, it's not being consumed. And so we're going to stop right there and just unpack that for a little bit. Now on Sundays, when we're in the building, and actually we've been doing this on video online as well, but when our acolytes begin our service by lighting the candles, and I'm sure you know this, that for us, that symbolizes the presence of God with us. And that symbol is not anything new, not even for the modern church, not even for the medieval church. That symbol of the presence of God being in and being symbolized by fire has been around for a long, long, long time. I'm not even sure when it's first mentioned like that in Scripture, but I do know that at least it goes back to the story in Genesis, the covenant story of God with Abraham. You can read about it in Genesis 15:17, which I'll do right here. It says, when the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking firepot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram and said, to your descendants, I give this land. And so we have this important symbolism of the divine here on this holy, sacred mountain. But we also have it in the burning bush. And so all of this together is very much like a sort of a sacramental window into which we see God's presence. And it's a presence, this is very important. That's kind of the main point for today. It both reveals God, but it also hides God. It reveals, but also hides. And that's so important because a lot of the Old Testament imagery is really about that. And it's really on display in these verses here. It reveals God because this ever-burning shrubbery out in the wilderness next to the holy mountain signals God's merciful accommodation. God draws near to us. God comes down from the mountain to meet Moses in the bush. But at the same time, this flame that was kept on burning, this inextinguishable flame, is a sign of God's awesomeness and His powerful holiness. It's a fiery holiness that is both dangerous and attractive, frightening and comforting, untamed, but at the same time, it's reassuring. And so Moses' life now is about to change because God is drawing near to God, and now God speaks to Moses, and God instructs Moses to, and you know the story, to remove the sandals from his feet. Take off your sandals, it's holy ground. Okay, this is also symbolic, and you probably know it. It's a gesture that goes back in ancient practice. Whenever you enter a holy place of divine presence, you take off your shoes, you take off your sandals. It's a gesture that honors the holiness of this ground, of this mountain and this God. And of course, removing shoes is still kind of a show of reverence. I mean, you go to a mosque, it's still practiced in Islam, they take off their shoes. And even Christians sometimes remove their shoes in worship. Maybe we should do it more. We've got several people in our contemporary service that do that. You might remember Sam Swaney if you come to our contemporary service. She used to always take off her shoes when she was leading worship. I remember back when I was at Roswell Methodist that the youth group had gone on a retreat or had a Bible study or something, but a lot of kids started taking off their shoes when they came into the sanctuary for worship. And I remember this little old lady cornering me about it one day, and she said, why are these young people coming into the sanctuary with their shoes off? It's so disrespectful. And I had to say to her, no, ma'am, just the opposite. And remind her of this whole burning bush, this holy ground episode. And she was like, oh, well, I still don't like it. But that's not the only thing that's significant about removing sandals. There's there's another layer. In the last episode, you might remember that we talked about that Moses never felt at home in Midian. He even named his son Gershom, which means I have been an alien residing in a foreign land. And so, he had never felt at home just about anywhere, though. He was raised by this Pharaoh's daughter who was a Hebrew, and so he wasn't accepted by his own people. He thought he would be. Remember, he tried to break up that fight, but they said, "Who are you?" So he wasn't even accepted by his own people, the Hebrew people. And then the Egyptian Pharaoh, I don't think he ever really liked him. And then when he found out about him, killing this guy for protecting a Hebrew, he tried to kill him. And so he ran off. And then the Midianites, they see him as a foreigner. Or, in chapter 2, they refer to him as an Egyptian. And so Moses is not fully home anywhere in any human community. And so remember, taking off one's sandals is a gesture in many traditional cultures, even today. It is a sign of being at home. You take off your shoes, you're home. And so here at the foot of the mountain, Moses, the alien, the foreigner, has at last found a true home. Moses found his true home not with humans, but with God. when a little bit earlier, when Moses was coming, God sees Moses coming towards the bush, and God calls out to him from the bush, and he says, Moses, Moses, twice, Moses, Moses. And so anytime you want to emphasize something in Hebrew, you double it, you repeat it. But when you double a name, it is a way of expressing intimacy, the depth of a relationship. And so when Abraham was up on the mountain and he was going to sacrifice Isaac and he has his knife raised, the angel stopped him by saying, Abraham, Abraham. And then he spoke to Abraham about God knowing his heart. The Apostle Paul, when he was pursued by Jesus on the road to Damascus, he said, I heard a voice saying to me in the Hebrew language, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Because God was initiating this relationship with him that would turn Saul into Paul. And so here, for God to say, Moses, Moses, was his way of saying, I know you, Moses, and I want to be close to you. And so this is God that draws near, but it's also a God who is mysterious and holy. And all these words play together in tension with one another. Like I mentioned earlier, it's so dangerous and attractive, frightening and comforting, untamed, but at the same time, it's reassuring, it's comforts and disturbs. That is the presence of God. All right, so that's the story we're covering today. And now that we've heard the story and I've kind of unpacked it a little, I want to read to you the actual text and see if you can see some of these things going on. All right, let me pick it up here. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. There's that double name in Hebrew. And Moses said, Here I am. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Here's God is mysterious and powerful and sacred. And then he said this, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. It's like, take off your shoes, Moses. I am the God of your ancestors. It's, in many ways, if this makes sense, it's almost like says, I want to be close to you, Moses, but don't come near. It's this sort of dichotomy that's going on. And so that's where we want to stop with the story today. You've seen the text. You sort of heard it unpacked. And I just want to draw a little practical message from this, if I can, from these last, these first few verses of Exodus 3. So God has been described by some theologians, the definition of who God is wholly other. God is wholly other. God is not like us. We are his creation. It's not the other way around. But yet, we want to know him. We want to understand. And so we try to use terms to help us understand. Terms like shepherd or friend or king. But the problem is that once we begin to try and define him in our own terms, we have somehow, in some ways, lessened him. We made him a little bit too small because he's so much beyond that. He's beyond our grasp of thinking. And so how do we balance this? How do we know who he is? How do we draw near in this intimacy with God? Books and hymns and art for all generations have tried to capture this, to lead us in a place of understanding. And I think really good art can leave open this mysteriousness for us, this holiness and otherness. And one of the places I think about this is the Chronicles of Narnia. I hope you're familiar with that. There's movies of it now. I read the books when I was a kid and as an adult too. But if you know the Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis, the God character is Aslan. who is a lion. And so early on in the book, Mrs. Beaver, the Beaver couple, Mr. and Mrs. Beaver, they're trying to explain to one of the children who have come through the wardrobe into Narnia, into this mysterious place with talking animals. She's trying to explain to them about Aslan and giving the description of this lion. And so Lucy, stops her and says, "Is Aslan safe? Is Aslan safe?" To which Mr. Beaver says, "Safe? Safe? Who said anything about safe? Of course he isn't safe. But he's good. He's a king, I tell you." I think when it comes to intimacy with God, which I think most of us want to have, right? When it comes, we have to know that it begins with coming to terms with the holiness of God. Holiness is the very first of all the nature of God. It is the infinitely high and noble essence of what God is and how God reveals God's self to us. And so when we truly reckon in God's presence, not trying to make God into our own essence, not my buddy Jesus or Jesus is my boyfriend, when we really, truly reckon God's presence, we have to come to terms with who God is, this holy other. And so that's where Moses finds himself. And that's where we're going to pick this up next Tuesday. And so I think about that over the weekend. And online worship is at Conyers First tomorrow at 11. I hope you will join us. It's Memorial Day. We got some nice things planned for that. I think it's going to be a good service. It's also Ascension Sunday. I'm preaching on that. And so until then, keep bringing the hope. And I hope you have a really nice rest of this Saturday. Bye-bye.